Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Today in our tradition is the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, commemorating the destruction of the first and the second temples, as well as a bunch of other things that have happened, calamities that have historically been attributed to this date in Jewish history. So it's a day of contemplation. It's a day of fasting. Sasha and I are both fasting today. A day of subdued spirits. So that may affect how I react to things.
Glad it's morning and not.
Conditioning of about 50 years or 60 years of doing this. Whether I like it, whether I believe in the day or not. This year, this day has special meaning for many of us as a day of lamenting not so much what others have done to us as a Jewish people, but what perhaps we as a Jewish people have done to others in the last few years, in particular in Israel, Palestine. It's a day of reflecting on the issue of anti-Semitism and how much of it we might be possibly responsible for, what we need to be aware of. So in that spirit, I'd like to offer our prayer to begin this morning as we study Torah, as we study wisdom and knowledge from the past, as we try to understand the mistakes that were made and not go down the same route as others have gone. To honestly look at ourselves as individuals, as communities, as faith traditions, with a critical eye, knowing that this is how God created us, God's own image, to be able to look at the creation with a critical eye and offer corrections from time to time. Those corrections, I think we term as redemption, salvation. May we be part of that salvation. May we be part of that redemption, not leave it to others. Together in our own separate faith traditions, we say, Amen. Pedagogically, we made a mistake. The mistake was not to put the
Because we're created in God's image, but we're still a little lower than God.
We should have put the Frederick Douglass piece last week, I think. That would have made more sense chronologically, and also some of the issues that came up as if we were ignoring the African American experience. But perhaps we saved the best and the most important for last. Again, on this day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. So we've got a crowded schedule of things to do today. We'll see how much we get in. But we want to thank Madalena for coordinating everything at a tech level and for Joyce doing it here. And we'll ask Madalena, we'll ask you to play the first video for us.
This video is just a brief, because for some of us, we may not know a lot about Frederick Douglass. Or thank you, American history that we've been taught. But this is a great, just little like 2-minute mini biography. So we all kind of get a sense of who he was. Extraordinary, yeah. Oh, nice.
Can you hear are you listening to the audio?
No. Turned up.
Famed author Frederick Douglass worked tirelessly as an abolitionist and an advocate for equal rights.
You can't talk about the history of civil rights in this country without talking about Frederick Douglass. Long before Dr. King, the civil rights movement, here's a man who was talking about basic dignity for people in this country.
Born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland, around 1818, Frederick Douglass became educated first through his master's wife and eventually on his own. Douglass escaped slavery in 1838 by fleeing to New York and became a preacher the following year.
Certainly, during Douglass's time, literacy for Africans was absolutely forbidden. In fact, it was very clear that once Africans could read and write, many wrote their own passes, which allowed them to move from place to place, and obviously this was disruptive to a very repressive system.
after his anti-slavery lectures caught the attention of William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the abolitionist paper, The Liberator. Douglass began touring the United States as a speaker with the American Anti-Slavery Society.
Many whites refused to believe that Frederick Douglass had ever been a slave because he was so obviously intelligent, he was such a powerful speaker.
In 1845, Douglass wrote and published his first autobiography entitled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Although the book was a U.S. bestseller, Douglass was forced to live in Europe for 2 years to evade recapture. He ultimately purchased his freedom in 1847.
People were shocked about Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave, writing his autobiography, and it was so poignant, and it was such a bird's-eye view of what was going on the plantation. He put it in very plain language, and it was just a powerful testimony of why slavery needed to end in our country.
Douglass became the only African American to attend the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848, and by 1861, Douglass was famous nationwide, advising both President Lincoln and Johnson on the welfare of African Americans.
By any measure, Frederick Douglass was a real American hero. He was a public intellectual, he was a statesman, he was an activist, and his life and his political commitment were dedicated to human rights, not just to civil rights or to the end of slavery.
During his lifetime, Douglass was U.S. Ambassador to the Dominican Republic, and in 1872, he became the first African American to appear on a presidential ballot when he was nominated as vice president. Frederick Douglass died on February 20th, 1895, from natural causes.
Do you guys hear that okay? Yeah. Yeah, he was a major, like one of the first feminists. That's why he was on as a vice president, because the women had their own party and they were nominating a woman to be president, and they put Frederick Douglass as their vice president. So he just had a very interesting life. Yeah. He was born in a plantation, and then he was sold up north, and his wife, the wife of his master, taught him to read and write. And then when the master found out, he was not happy about it, talked the wife out of not doing that anymore. Then he escaped, and then he continued to teach himself how to read and write, then escaped and became this brilliant thinker and writer, and just very impressive life. Yeah.
Okay, we brought a small excerpt from this very, very, very long speech. And originally I meant to add a link to the speech, but if you're interested, you can find it online. It is a bit of a chore to read through it. And
Too bad though. It took me less than an hour. Well, I mean, you have to read through because of all the arguments too. You kind of want to it's a rhetorical piece, so you want to not just skim through it. You want to what's he saying?
but not what we think of as a speech. It's invited, that somebody's invited to a conference.
No, they were clearly, it was the one that they were not expecting.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. And so that's why I brought the beginning of it, because of that kind of, is a surprise salvo, I think, of his speaking. So you've got some background here at the top. We don't need to really, certainly don't need to read that out loud. But I suggest we go around, we read the speech as we do other texts and give it that respect. There's more, do we have more printed text? Oh, yeah.
Do we need some more? I can make some more copies.
I can get some.
Okay, why don't you take yours and.
Everyone that doesn't have, I've got some writing on mine, just borrow yours, Jeffrey, and I'll rip copies of it. I'll bring it back. Here. How many copies are you?
One. There's some extra money. We can share too.
Yeah,
We can share.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
We have yours.
Yeah.
Middle drawer open.
Go get more.
This is why I took the first 4 years. I'll do, wait, no, you don't, wait. Better now.
Okay. Would you like to begin?
Would you read the first paragraph?
Okay. Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, he who could address the audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me, quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech.
I love that word quailing, Middle English for shrinking in fear.
Yeah.
The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way for me. It is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me in their presence. Go on to the next one. For this purpose of this celebration is the 4th of July. It is the birth of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I'm glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. And so young, 76 years. It's a good age for a man, but a mere speck in the life of a nation. 70 years and 10 is a allotted time for individual men, but nations number their years in thousands. According to this fact, you are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, and I'm glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon.
Let's take a break now, maybe just for some initial, it'll be too long by the time we get some initial reactions to the flavor, the tone, content.
He's not saying his nation, your nation.
It's not we.
Yeah, yours, not yours.
Yeah, perfect. And I don't think that's I don't think that's style. I think that's intentional. One might say, to make it personal. We have an interesting tradition that perhaps you know at the Seder. Douglas mentions the Passover, the Seder, the evening meal, where there's it was originally a pedagogical tool for the leader of the Seder to know there are different kinds of people listening. And so in that pedagogical tool, there's the parable of the 4 sons. And the 4 sons, there's the wise son, the wicked son, the young son who's the simpleton, the one, and the older Haggadot, the idiot son, and then the one who's not old enough to ask. And while originally that was a piece to get the leader of the Seder ready for how to explain the complicated story of the Exodus, it became part of the liturgy itself. And in the liturgy, when you get to the wicked son, it says the wicked son says to his father, "What are these laws to you?" And then the rabbis add on to it. This is something from a tradition from the 2nd, 3rd century of Common Era. He says, "What are they to you?" He doesn't say, "What are they to us?" He's taken himself out of the equation. That's what a wicked son would do in the stereotypical, not so educational today, part of the Passover Haggadah. It feels that's what shouted out to me right away. You folks, this is you all, right? It's not me.
It also sort of reminded me, it's very ironical. And it sort of reminds me of the famous speech in Julius Caesar, where I come not to praise Caesar, or to criticize him, but to praise him. But he was an honorable man. Like, you're constantly hearing what his real argument is. Like, he's saying something, but it's about something very different. That yours is very pointed.
The question, of course, is, would we know it's about something different if we were reading for the first time? In Julius Caesar or here. In other words, we know what he's about to do. I think most of us know, right? But can you imagine being in this hall, all these people?
Yeah, because they were expecting just a celebration of America.
Listening to this and then beginning to hear you.
They're starting to hear like, oh, this doesn't sound quite like what I was expecting. I'm sure there's a tone of anger.
You have a different view.
I don't think it was uncommon in 1950s. That was probably normal. If you were enslaved, you weren't part of the country, you weren't a citizen. So that was a normal thing.
But to talk to white people like that probably would be, like, white people wouldn't be expecting to
If
hear
it
that.
was me, I wouldn't be saying our country is.
Sure, that's what I mean, yeah. But it-
Yeah, I think we,
I
in
think it's
retrospect, I
just
think we
kind of normal back then, unfortunately, but it wasn't his country.
But he addresses the whole thing as Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens.
Yeah, he was
He
respectful.
says fellow citizens twice.
Well, he really and he also like really pumps up like how you're an estimable group. Anybody, I'm but a lowly nothing to speak before you. I've never been so nervous to talk. He's already a famous orator. So he's already buttering them up, like you are so important. And then, so they're probably expecting like, he's really setting them up for a big praise thing. And then it's gonna get into a bunch of routine. Yeah.
Anybody
very
home?
clever.
Anybody home? Like, yes, please go ahead, Rosemary.
Yeah, I had a question, but I think Pastor Jane, you answered it. Is there background as to why he was asked to give this speech?
Well, he's already really famous in that little biography. By 1840, he was a popular speaker in the North to talk about the horrors of slavery. So this group would have felt really lucky to have him to come and talk, because he's speaking to all these he's already published books, he's already well-known celebrity, that's agrees with them that slavery's bad. So that's what they're expecting to hear. Like, we're all the same page, we're on the same team here, and then he's gonna stick it between the eyes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Can we go ahead, move ahead?
Okay.
To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. And let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, lowering up to heaven, were thrown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying that nation in irreparable ruin. I can today take up the plaintive lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down.
We need to flesh this out before we continue saying. So what did he say? The quote, of course, is from Psalms. It's one of the Psalms which we call an exilic psalm. It's not from King David. It could not be from King David unless King David had the prophecy to write it, which is traditional rabbinic understanding. And it is an entire people. It was an entire people. It was a leadership historically, but in the minds and the history of Jews, and then adopted by Christians as well, was this entire nation was exiled from Judah, from Jerusalem to Babylon. And there so what is he doing? Why is he quoting this here?
Possibly because our nation was very much more religious as a whole then probably than we are now. So he's trying to put it maybe into an example that they will understand from their background.
And what do you think he wanted them to understand?
That they were doing to the black man the same thing that had been done to the Jews. So.
He was also a pastor, that was his first, so he was probably very well schooled, and he includes a lot of scripture here, so the people would know that, and he would be very well schooled. So.
And I don't think it's meant to be a direct parallel. It's a parallel he brings here, but it's not a complete parallel. It's not we call an allegory. It's just more of the metaphorical aspect of it, of the people that have been brought someplace else who are in exile. I don't really belong here. I'm not supposed to be here, maybe. But in any case, one of mourning. Yes.
Yeah, that last line of the paragraph before that, under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon, is this foreshadowing the Civil War? I mean, because this was, 10 years before that war. Was he talking about that's brewing, or is he foreshadowing his argument, his parallel between Israel and America? You think he's doing that?
Well, if you read the whole letter, and I recommend you do, because there's just a lot in here that you don't get to read today. But one of the things he's really critical of is this Fugitive Slave Act that was just recently voted on. It was a way of appeasing the South. And what the Fugitive Slave, slaves were, if you're free, you could flee to the North. But the Fugitive Slave Act said that any slave that's caught that's fleeing in the North has to be sent back. So the African American community was, pretty furious that America had walked back on its work to move forward to freeing slaves, because this was making it a terror wherever you live in this country.
Sounds like today.
I think that might have even been the reason that 12 Years a Slave, and he's a freedman in the story 12 Years a Slave, but they still sent him back to be a slave. So there was a lot of that going on in the North before the Civil War.
He also says, "Do you mean to mock me?"
Yeah.
So he's pointing up the fact that apparently you don't understand that I am a slave too.
Yeah.
And you bring me here. So I thought that was very.
Can you imagine being in the audience and hearing him say sentence like that? Did you break, you're so great, did you break your, I mean, it's so sarcastic. Yeah.
Roman.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all the other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may. Search where you will. Roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. Travel through South America. Search out every abuse. And when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation. And you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
My thought after I read that, I said, "Oh my goodness, I'm surprised they didn't kill him."
Well, he was in the North.
Yeah, well.
Well, he was so, I think probably too, he was of such high esteem.
True.
It's sort of like Martin Luther King. It kind of reminds me like talking to white people and, not mincing words and the white people like taking it, they may not like it and they're really uncomfortable, but the people on his, the pro King people aren't gonna, they're just, but it's hard to hear. That's really,
especially during that time.
especially during that time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Simon Cowell had the famous thing on American Idol or whatever it's on. Said, well, yeah, I didn't expect that.
Mm-hmm.
So I bet they were shocked.
Totally.
Reactions from home. Please, go ahead,
I-
Rosemary.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking of the audience as he was giving this speech, what their reaction was. Did people get up and walk out? Was there booing? Was there shock? To hear this when in the beginning it said they might have been thinking he was going to give this glorious speech. The audience just kind of struck me what their reaction might have been.
Do we know? I don't know, but did you read anything?
No, but I would say that if you go and read the whole thing, he also then goes on to talk about how great this country, what the great ideas that were this country and the great intentions that the founding fathers had, that liberty, justice, and all that surpass anything else. That they're the greatest things. If they just stopped, they just didn't, they're not complete. And they were supposed to be complete by the time of 1852. So he kind of, he makes you feel good about America, but then disappointed that we're not as far as we are. And then he just, and that's kind of his main argument then, is that you continue to undermine the great values that this country was founded on. And actually, I copied out part of it just that I thought would be interesting, because he talks about the church and how the church has really failed in its acts of omission, of not working hard enough, and its acts of commission, letting this Fugitive Slave Act pass. And, I'll just pass this along. So you can just, we won't read it today, but I just thought I would share that, because I think it's just interesting how his and I'll send it to you guys so you can take a look. It's just part of this. You can just see like his, he's the indictment of the church with this, that I thought would be interesting for us to also take in. But that's, I think, how he avoided causing a riot or anything. It was it was something that I'm sure really hit their hearts. If you're right, we're failing right now. And then the Constitution says, talks about all people in this. And so his argument is like, clearly the people that wrote the Constitution know that we're all equal. Like they know that what they created is an incomplete document when they wrote it. And it's clear that they believe that slaves are full people in the fact, the way that they word things. So why aren't we living up to the Constitution? Those kind of things. So it's a really good speech. Doesn't take quite an hour. 30 minutes. Or more. But it's amazing, like in those days, like they talked a long time. People, they weren't on their phones and connected to other things. So but it's written so beautifully too. It's so,
and maybe they weren't so quickly canceled.
They weren't so quickly canceled.
I think the background of the question. To go around and ask the folks, do you remember when you first heard of this speech or of this man?
I was an adult.
You were an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I grew up in Alabama and we had very whitewashed history. I didn't know anything about Black Wall Street, nothing about any of the race riots, Tulsa, none of it. I never heard that until George Floyd beat it.
Wow. I will tell you, I grew up in Sherman Oaks, rather liberal Sherman Oaks, San Fernando Valley. I don't remember hearing about any of this either. It could be, I don't remember. Also, I kind of ended my public school education in 9th grade and was in Israel for a year and then came back to an Orthodox day school. So
I grew up in some of the best public schools in the country. Never, in fact, I was telling Rabbi the other day, like I always get mixed up Frederick Douglass and Stephen Douglas, who was the candidate, the Democrat candidate against Lincoln in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. So I always got mixed up, like, what does this have to do with the Lincoln-Douglas debates? That's just, I knew more about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and I didn't even know that much about those than I did about this. In fact, I think the first time I heard about this, was when Juneteenth became a national holiday, and then they started talking about this.
Can I at the risk of putting you on the spot, one of the younger people here, may I ask? You knew it was coming, right? When you're very well read, Grace. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
We're honored to have you, but what do you remember about first hearing?
I remember being a child.
Yeah.
I do remember learning about Frederick Douglass in school, but to give additional context, I also grew up going to the Child Development Center over here off of Rosa Parks here in Palm Springs. I went to, was probably 100% African-American teachers and probably 95% African-American students. And so there was an additional layer of learning about African-American culture and history. But that said, they also did other cultural traditions at that childcare as well. And we have lots of photos that show all of these different cultural traditions that were represented. But when I got to visit Almonte Elementary School, we still did learn about all of them. But it was not in depth. Certainly, I didn't know about this speech until I was in college. So it was more superficial in grade school.
I learned in grade school about it.
And where was that?
Kansas City, Kansas. Yeah. I was all black schools, all through until my senior year. I transferred to a school that was predominantly white. They had lots of other ethnicities there, but this particular part we didn't learn about in school. We learned the basics about who Frederick Douglass was, but I was shocked just reading this here today. I mean, I don't even remember any of Martin Luther King's speeches having any of this information in there. I don't. I mean, it would, yeah.
Poke in the bear.
Oh yeah, this would have really poked hard, if he was preached any part of this. This is pretty powerful stuff.
I grew up in Indiana. I was born in Kentucky. I grew up in Indiana. My father was a Methodist minister. And at that time, the Methodist Church was segregated. And that didn't end until I think in the 60s.
68 when it became United.
Somewhere along there when it became United Methodist. So having gone to black schools and black colleges, I know I'm familiar with much of that. I think my parents found a way to make sure we could see all sides of everything, even despite the way we were brought up. And I think that is a way of life that we have continued in my family throughout. My sister was a missionary, and through all this terrible stuff. Of course, Indiana was supposed to be the seat of the Ku Klux Klan, so there's this the interaction of belonging, not belonging, belonging, not belonging all the time. But you press on and you become who you are, a person of God, and that's the most important thing. So that's my story.
Sorry. Buddy at home? Dan, did you want to say something? You need to unmute. Got some.
Okay. I grew up in New Jersey, just outside of New York City, northern New Jersey in the 50s. And we didn't realize until later how closed and
Next door, slide are open.
restricted our education had been. Just one example thing. First of all, I don't remember the first time I heard Frederick Douglass. It certainly was not during my primary or high school education. What I do remember from texts early on is the view of Reconstruction was presented with the emphasis of opportunists, white opportunists from the South and white opportunists from the North, the scalawags and the carpetbaggers coming in to take advantage of the federal government's imposition of Reconstruction. And this was in a textbook in Northern New Jersey. And that was the view that was given to us pretty uncritically, as I remember, in that era. The other thought that occurred to me in reading this speech, which I have to say, I've not seen before, is that its structure, particularly with the parts that are add on about asking America to live up to its promise, reminds me of the structure of the prophetic readings we do in synagogue, many of the Haftarot, where there's this thunderous denunciation of the people and their practices, and generally finishing with saying, "You can be better." Those are thoughts that occurred to me.
Wanda?
Well, I've heard Frederick Douglass' name, but I really did not know about him. I grew up in Wyoming and North Dakota, and I did not meet a Black person until I was 19 years old. And so I was very isolated. I knew a lot of Mexicans and I knew a lot of Native Americans. We had a lot of Native Americans where I lived. And just listening to how he wrote this and the courage and determination that he had to give this to this audience, I mean, had to have just been, I'm sure they were just stunned and thinking, first of all, how could he do this? And then I would hope realize, wow, he's holding up a mirror to us and having us look at what we're doing. And as we were reading this, I kept thinking, I wish that we had people like this now that were looking and holding a mirror up to us and saying, look what we're doing, because it's just unbelievable what we're going through again and continuing in this country. So I was really taken back by this and realized how isolated I grew up in this little tiny world until I moved out of there. And we can still learn and wake up at our age wherever we are. So thank you for this. This is powerful.
Thanks. Anybody else at home? And here in the room?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
But I've never heard this speech before, and I'm like, wow, he's blowing these people away. My gosh, and I think what happens is that it translates into white guilt as opposed to white determination to not let this happen again. And but I was just like, wow, this man, he had a lot of courage to say these things back in the day. And I just can't believe it. I need to do more research on this. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm with you, literally. None of this I have ever studied before. We escaped from China, and I knew a lot of white people because they had children that I played with. And there's Asians, of course. And when you go to Brazil, in Brazil, you're either white or black. Whatever is 50% more, 50% more, like 55%, I don't know how they figured it out. All documents had only white and black. So I went to my teacher and said, there's nothing here about Asians or She said, "Oh no, honey, you're not black, so you're white." So that was it. I played with black children and I played with white children, and it was in the United States the first time that I was distinctly told I am different from majority of the students, that there is this thing that says Asian, Oriental, at that time it was Oriental. And it was probably the first time that I was discriminated in school, that I was different. I didn't belong to anybody. I was the only one in school that was Asian. But through the time that I worked with Human Relations Commission, and I used to represent for 5 years, represent the city of Palm Springs at the California level on Human Relations Commission. I did learn a lot about how different people were being treated. And crazy enough, can't believe this, but the city council had decided the Human Relations Commission was a proper place to investigate complaints.
Oh, that was a while ago.
Here I am, a 30-some-year-old Asian, going to the school board and complaining about some school issues. City of Palm Springs themselves, and I was a ergonomic physical therapist, and I had my certificate, so I got called into all sorts of stuff where it is the patient who's a worker and gotten hurt, and so they wanted more feedback on what they should do. But the thing that I really have to say, it was this country the first time that I was really discriminated. And then in my high school, I luckily got along with everybody, but I was invited. I was the first colored person, and I didn't realize I was considered colored until I was in high school, to join a sorority, because up to then there were black students there and there were very few Asians. But it was this country that taught me that this discrimination comes in all sorts of ways. When I got to UCLA, of course, you'd be silly to go try to pledge for sorority, because only white girls could be selected for sororities. There's no sororities that want an Asian. So it was really, here I learned more and more about how people were discriminated. And Corey Crawford is one of my first friends, and that's, Grandma Crawford. Okay, so I used to go drive myself in there and go do things with Cora, and her aunt always did things to help me out. And so okay. And then one day she said to me, "Honey, don't come when it's dark." And I said, "Why?" Because it's dangerous here. And I said, "Okay." I went home. He was 27, I was 22. What did we know? We went to everybody's house and we had all sorts of patients at hospitals. So we didn't even know. But I'll tell you guys one thing you may not know. There was actually, during the Watts riot, there was actually a march. Somebody worked up a march on the North End. I'm sure you remember that. The Human Relations Commission chair was Rabbi Hurwitz, Jewish, and Pastor Lily was blind, black, a preacher, and there's yours truly in my 30s, an Asian woman. And I was shaking in my boots because we were stopping, the police was there with no violence, they were marching. And Rabbi stopped them and said, "We know you have complaints. You have very legit complaints. We are sure of that. We're not saying that there's something, everything is okay, because everything's not." I wasn't waiting in restaurants and stores, so, obviously. But this is not the way to answer it. We will arrange for a city hall meeting, and everybody in the city is welcome to come. We will have an agenda, and everybody gets to speak, doesn't matter how long, but this is not what we want to do. We don't want to do, in the street. We don't want you to get hurt. We don't want anybody else to get hurt. And finally, the black pastor, I'll never forget him.
We need this.
Oh, sorry.
We had a big class.
But it happened here. It happened here. It didn't. Palm Springs was not, not literally white either.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for bringing it home, and
for sure.
Important connections. And as we often mention, we're sitting on section 14 and the edge of it right now, but that's very much in our history here in Palm Springs. So I never heard of Juneteenth until I got here, and that was in 2015. In 2017, around, Rev Kev from Bloom in the Desert asked me to come and give the sermon. And he said, "Could you relate to Juneteenth?" And I said, "Well, sure," because I thought for sure I needed to know what that was, and looked it up quickly and found out what it was. But still, it wasn't until a few years later that it became, a number of years later, that it became an official holiday. But I had no idea. And even knowing about Juneteenth, I still asked one of the very few African American friends that we see socially, what she'll be doing for July 4th. And she kind of laughed, said, "Why would I celebrate July 4th? And of course, I was immediately ashamed that I asked a question in my insensitivity. But that brought it home. That was probably 3 or 4 years ago, so I didn't really, none of this brought it home. And I wish, I mean, if I was teaching young people in the Jewish world today, this would be a key text. And I'm really happy the Faith250 folks that put this kind of core group of texts together included this text. And of course, Carrie, there are lots of other texts we could be doing that lift up the plight of other non-whites in this country and non-Christians in this country.
I was raised in Texas mostly. And when I went to junior high, because I'm that old, I learned about Juneteenth, but not in this sense. And I went to a school, my junior high and the high school was an integrated school, but not in the sense of celebration, but more in a sense of, oh, good. Texas, we had the last battle of the Civil War, and isn't that great for us, Totally different context than how it was probably perceived in other areas of the state.
West North slider open.
Well, this is a great segue into the next kind of section of our study today. And then we'll wrap it, we'll come around, if you haven't seen the sheet, Juneteenth, then a little bit back to some biblical sources, which are in the background of everything we do in our two faith traditions. And then we'll talk a little bit about the African American Jewish experience, which is an interesting and strange episode in American history. I relate to a little bit, not being an expert. But why don't we move ahead with our text from the Emancipation Proclamation, which I did learn about as a kid, I remember. Please go ahead.
Okay. President Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. That on the first day of January in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, henceforward, and forever free. I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And upon this act, sincerely believe to be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
Comments or reactions before put it a little bit into historical context?
Well, did that mean, because to be honest, I can't really hear it read, it's really helpful because you kind of skim through it. Did that mean like he was also saying all the slaves in the South were free, and that caused them the South to say, "Oh no, you aren't. Like we're setting up our own country," and is that how?
No, because this is
how the dead dominoes
1863.
fell? Yeah, so that must have been how the dominoes fell.
So they didn't feel that they
that's
were
right.
part of the United States.
This is 2 years after.
Yeah, that's right. It had already started.
I didn't know it was January 1st.
So
I never.
and the night before, there were vigils in different churches. Douglas was speaking at a church, a Zion Church at AME, and wrote someplace, I can't read my writing.
Something New York,
But,
Rochester. Well,
Yeah, but in another place, was this William Wells Brown wrote an emancipation hymn. I just brought one verse from that.
Yeah.
Would you read it?
Me?
Yeah.
O God of freedom, hear our prayer, and guided by thy saving hand, may slave the sweets of freedom share, and light and liberty possess.
And there are other examples that one can find on the internet of liturgy from that particular. I looked for it this year for our own service, our Friday night service, to incorporate. But of course, it didn't really work, did it? And then this is an episode that I had no idea about. Could you read the next one? Or number 5?
Yeah. Lincoln proclamation appointing a national fast day, March 30th, to be observed on April 30th. We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven, but we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness.
So my fascination with this is the religion coming into it. It's not just you using God in a rhetorical sense in the speech. It's calling for a fast day. Of course, I mentioned as we came in today, this is a fast day for us. I think fast days are a good thing. I don't know. I don't know. There's people that fast during Lent, actually fast, but
some do.
But probably not in this Methodist church.
Oh,
yeah,
probably not. You know.
Yeah, not that. By the way, I don't think anybody else in Or Hamidbar is fasting today.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you are. I don't know, but it's not common.
I mean, sometimes, like I know in the Methodist, like when there's a big vote coming on or whatever, the bishop has called for days of prayer and fasting. Yeah, I don't. Yeah.
So it's something that's used quite often in the Jewish tradition, but of course our Muslim siblings are very aware of fasting and the power of fasting. It's something that it's something for us to think about, I think, perhaps. But if we could go back to you, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. I don't know.
Oh, Tonette.
Tonette.
Yeah.
Tonette from Texas. Could you please read? We go back. You get to read number 6. Yes.
Union General Gordon Granger, General Order Number 3, June 19, 1865. The people were informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them become that between employer and hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere.
And we thought this was such a noble. Reactions at home, comments before we get back to the room here. Don't want to leave you guys out. Yes, Rosemary.
I was surprised to hear that they had to stay where they lived currently. My first thought was, well, if they had a master who was cruel to them, how would he treat them now that they are free? I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at it wrong. I'm reading something into this. But it was just a little surprising that they needed to stay where they were.
Surprising or irritating?
Irritating more, I guess, that they weren't allowed to go and make their own home and start their own life, where technically they were still under a master because he was going to pay them, and would he pay them fairly?
Yeah, to me a little less surprising, only that when people with power get power taken away from them, and even if they're forced to say, like we were when we were kids, say you're sorry. Remember when we used to say you're sorry, like I'm sorry,
Sorry, not sorry.
Sorry,
not sorry. Yeah.
Does this mean that their homes became theirs? If they were taken away from the master? But it says, because the, between former masters and slaves and the connection heretofore existing between them become that between employer and hired labor. The freed are allowed to advise to remain in their homes, but it says earlier, this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves.
Yeah, I don't think they had property. I don't think that, I'm guessing most people, I'm speaking, I don't really know, but it seems to me that there would be an arrangement which would continue to keep them down, which is exactly what happened. That's what Jim Crow is, right?
Right.
So it's,
Right.
you don't really have your house. Now you pay the company for rent. So anyway,
some of the, I've been watching a lot of, there's a lot of movies about Black history. And a lot of the slaves, even though they were free, they chose to stay, on the plantations. And some of the plantation owners were gracious enough to give some of the slaves some of the land so that they could, grow their own crops and so I kind of understand this part of it, be it right or be it wrong, but there were a lot of slaves, they didn't know what else to do. So a lot of them stayed on those plantations. So it was kind of, I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. I had no idea about how bad, the civil rights and slavery, all that stuff was. I mean, we learned a little bit in school, but my parents never talked to us about what they went through during those times. I mean, I didn't know till a year before my dad died in 2015 that, he and my mom they were segregated bathrooms. I had no idea. They never talked to us about that stuff. We just lived our lives and we were taught to just be respectful of everybody, no matter who they were. And so I think, for a lot of the slaves back then, it was that's just the way it was, and it was the really strong ones, like, French that wanted to make a lot of changes, but a lot of them just didn't, that was all they ever knew. And so they didn't know how to survive outside of that. And how were they going to be treated if they left that, and that's what we're dealing with right now, and it's not targeting the Black people right now, but it's this thing about, okay, you don't belong here, and, how do you navigate through that when you're in the thick of it, like slaves were, back then. Today we have options, and it's a tough road to go through, but, we've got to stand together to try to make the changes that are necessary.
Yes.
Yeah, I was loving this piece until we got toward the very end of it. You're free, but you're not free.
Yeah.
It's this backhanded justice that we have suffered for so many years in this country. And I don't know if it's going to change or if it will ever change, to be candid with you. So that's my reaction to this piece.
I think it feels to me as a rabbi, I'm thinking of parallels in my own life and things that I've fought for. When I think of women's rights, and I'm ordained as a conservative rabbi, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but we call it the big C, not the little c. And there was an approach with allowing women to be counted in the quorum. This approach, which is pretty wide take, that will allow you to be part of the quorum. This is in the 80s, not part of a prayer quorum, which would then lead to the rabbinate as well. But you have to take upon yourself all of the obligations that men have. the fasting, the prayers, all the things that you are exempt from now according to Orthodox Jewish law. You've got to take all of them on. And of course, men off the street who didn't keep any of those things, they were included in the form. It's this backhanded justice. I know the term backhanded humor, but backhanded justice.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, I'm not very well. Say again, Rabbi.
Say it again.
He liked your term. Oh, like that term.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, okay. And then the same thing with LGBTQ in Jewish circles. It's this backhanded justice. We'll let you do this, but not relinquishing your male white control over the world.
It seems like there's always the fear, like you give people rights and then they're going to take over. Like that's always the threat.
Yeah.
So that's why you give people some group freedom, but then when they get a little too uppity, now we have to pull back and take some of that away. There's a ceiling there that if you're not white and male, that you're going to hit and you're going to get slammed back. So you see, that's kind of the history of. Well, when we talk about the history of the Methodist Church, I think that's it's kind of like the history of African Americans generally.
So back a second to the psychology of it, though. The slaves that didn't want to go someplace else. I don't know who's telling that story. Also, I'm also suspect of who's telling it that way. But that's what brought me to the section from Deuteronomy. Because again, as people of faith, people that were living in the 19th century, by the way, the rabbis who at the time were active and leaders in the mid-19th century took both sides of this issue of slavery, for instance. Took both sides of it. But the ones who I most identified with were absolutely, how could you possibly agree to this? And that's having Deuteronomy as a very important source in Jewish traditions. Why don't we take a look if you agree?
Deuteronomy 15, verses 7 through 18. If, however, there was a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily, and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land.
Let's take a break for just a second. So that the setup here is a society, a homogeneous society of people living in this promised land. This purports to be Moses before the people are going into the land after Joshua, right before his death. Of course, it's written hundreds of years later. But this ideal that there will always be poor people. And you have to make sure you continue to lend to them, even though the 7th year all debts are remitted. And even though in the 7th year, you have to trust that you'll have enough in your storehouses because you're not allowed to work the land, you still have to be generous. That's in the background of all this. Go ahead.
If a fellow Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, he shall serve you for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, do not let him go empty-handed. Furnish him out with a flock, threshing floor, and vats with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I enjoin this commandment upon you today. But should he say to you, I do not want to leave you, for he loves you and your household and is happy with you, you shall take an awl and put it through his ear into the door, and he shall become your slave in perpetuity. Do the same with your female slave. When you do set him free, do not feel aggrieved. For in the 6 years he has given you double the service of a hired man. Moreover, the Lord your God will bless you in all you do.
The different situation. This is slavery that is based upon poverty. Somebody does some damage or borrows money, they can't pay it back. they have to sell themselves into slavery. At least that's how it's described. There were certainly slaves from other lands that were brought in by wars and things like that. But this is talking about those that had citizenship, we'll call it right now. And so slavery is an issue. It's talked about, and it's limited to 7 years, right? That now, whether it means the official sabbatical of 7 years or that slave 7 years, rabbinical commentaries will debate forever. That's not the point. The point is they should go free. But what if they don't want to go free? That's what I was like. What if they want to stay? What do they want to? Because let's remember, the Israelites wandered around the desert, according to the story, for 40 years. Not written in the text explicitly, but pretty much agreed, because that generation of slaves could not be the ones to go into the land. They needed to die off. Right? The text is pretty explicit about the fact there were only two who survived, only two individuals, Joshua and Caleb, who survived that 40 years and came into the land. Because slave mentality doesn't do well with fighting a war to get into the, whatever, settling. But what if they don't want to? And then, are you familiar with this ear thing?
No.
Yeah, but it's something that all, because in the weekly Torah portion, and it comes during summertime. So I went to a very Jewish summer camp when we had the weekly Torah portion. And this idea that it's piercing the ear, right? In fact, when I had my ear pierced when I was young, somebody said, "Oh, so you're a slave now?" Right? It's not that they have to stay. It's not that they're hammered into the doorpost for the rest of their lives, right? It's just a procedure, a ceremony. It was done in order to pierce their ear, to remind them. The rabbinical commentary says is that you've got to remind them that the same ear that you hear, that you heard God saying you should be free and go into your 7th year, you decided to ignore. So now you're going to have this hole in your ear the whole time. Rabbinic commentary, not in the Bible itself.
Hey, Dad.
Yeah.
It was the right ear?
I don't remember if it says it or not.
Was it left ear?
When I did go to get my ear pierced,
No, it doesn't say.
when I did go to ear, I was 40, my 40th birthday. We had just 3 girls at the time. We go into one of these shops in Jerusalem where they do your ears. And the woman says, "Well, which ear? Your right ear or your left ear?" And our youngest one at the time, Abigail, says, "Just not the ear of the gay men." Because I guess in Israel, gay men had the earrings on one side. And
Right, interesting.
okay. So she was very explicit about that. Commentary on Deuteronomy or this issue and its connection. Lack thereof. It's in our faith tradition background, I guess I would want to say. And it's different, but there is what to do. So maybe something to introduce here.
Yeah, so we find, so there's, by the time that, for one thing, by the time the New Testament, that slavery was so pervasive over the Roman Empire. And in fact, I bought this book, I haven't read it yet, but it looks super interesting. We heard about like an officer review. It's called Not Built in a Day, How Slavery Made the Roman Empire. So this was just, it's probably not a whole lot different than the way the South was set up. The economy of Rome was really contingent on having slaves. So there's that's one thing I just want to lift up. So then when slaves came into the US, the thought was, well, if we Christianize them, they'll become nice people. They won't rebel, partly because of these New Testament texts and the whole idea of like, turn the other cheek and all these sorts of things. So masters would Christianize the slaves who were more familiar with their religious traditions back in Africa or Barbados or wherever they were, and it would all come from Africa. And then there was created, and some of you may know this, the Negro Bible, which this is a copy of something that was used in Barbados, but it came to the U.S. And it's just interesting because it takes out, for example, the Book of Exodus. It's not in this slave Bible, and pretty much anything talking about how people should be free, God liberates people, that's all taken out of the text. So what's focused on are the texts that, and what they were focused on when they would teach slaves were the texts or slaves are taught to love their masters, because that's the whole idea, and when we read it, like no ego and the least and the most, and we're all supposed to be loving and that sort of thing. Well, it had a much different flavor when you're a slave in the South and hearing these texts being taught you by your master. So I pulled out some of those texts, some of those scriptures that we can just look at. Ernie, do you want to? Yeah.
Okay.
Ernie, do you want to read the Luke text? This is a parable that it's in the lectionary, gets preached on frequently.
We're number 8.
I'm gonna pass because I'm not getting.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Jesus said, "Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron and serve me while I eat and drink. Later you may eat and drink'? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.'"
So, oftentimes this is preached about not, don't expect, we don't do this for thanks and all that sort of, like, that's how it's oftentimes preached. And that's, could be what was originally intended, but you could certainly see what the instruction here is for slaves.
Yeah, I can get really twisted.
Yeah.
Just reading this, I mean.
I know.
Yeah.
Like it's just open yourself up to humiliation and violence, Yeah.
In the guise of a theological metaphor.
Yeah. The guys. Yeah. I mean, the people, it's interesting. I mean, it would be interesting to do more research on this, because clearly some of the people that are hearing this are also slaves, because there's so many slaves in the Roman Empire. How they would have heard that, it'd be interesting to know that as well. Okay, let's hear now these next two are even more intense, more like focused on the way that Christianity was taught to slaves. Bill, would you read the Ephesians passage?
Sure. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ, not with a slavery performed merely for looks, to please people, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the soul. Render service with enthusiasm, as for the Lord and not for humans, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are enslaved or free. And masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both of you have the same Lord in heaven, and with him there is no partiality.
This is just bad. I mean.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to do a little more research into what the life of slaves in those days, because I like what I learned at seminaries, it wasn't quite the same, that the brutality against slaves and all that sort of thing was not part of the culture, so, but I don't know, it'd be interesting to learn.
What I know from the rabbinic world is that there's a famous slave named Tavi, of one of the important rabbis of the first 2 centuries. And to me, it feels like it's almost a mythology of, this is how we treat our slaves as one of our sons, kind of thing.
Yeah.
As a benbite, just as a butler, just around the whole time. But I don't think there's an answer to all. I think there's the gentrified culture of leadership that want to be humane, because that's what they've really taken out of their Bible, whether in the Christian or in the Jewish circles. And then there's those who are in business. So I think you would get the entire.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be one answer as to.
Right.
And I'm not sure how many slaves would actually be sitting in a collection of people listening to scriptures or listening to sermons.
And in the greater context, this is part of one of those like, wives, obey your husbands, husbands, love your wives, children, obey your parents. I mean, the whole thing was about the freedom that Christ gives you is an inner freedom. And it's whereas Jesus movement seems to be, it was very like a anti status, like there was no status. The low status people ate dinner with the high status, it was really challenging the social fabric. But after time, movements become institutions, and then the institution had to stay in power, keep its power. So it had to, it started becoming more conservative, and it became about, well, in Christ we have inner freedom, and so even though you might be a wife and you're low status, you're going to be treated better because your husband's going to be nice to you, but still you need to submit to them. So it was considered very advanced in kind of the spiritual way, whether or not it was, but that's kind of how the theology through time morphed into something much less than what the Jesus movement originally was.
Let's skip 10 and go to 11, an example of Judaism we don't know all that much about because it's not the rabbinic Judaism of the land of Israel. This is what's happening in Alexandria, where there was a very thriving Jewish community, spoke and wrote Greek. That's where we get the Septuagint from, the Greek translation. And Philo it writes a tremendous amount of philosophical writings and commentaries on the Torah. If you could read 11.
Servants rank lower in fortune, but in nature can claim equality with their masters. And in the law of God, the standard of justice is adjusted to nature and not to fortune. And therefore, the masters should not make excessive use of their authority over slaves by showing arrogance and contempt and savage cruelty. For these are signs of no peaceful spirit, but of one so intemperate as to seek to throw off all responsibility and take the tyrant's despotism for its model.
So not abolitionist at all, but what we would call it Yiddish Menschlichkeit. Be a mensch about it, right? This is reality, but really there's a deeper meaning. You've got to have that. Anything from home about these sources?
Dave, I think also the slaves don't work on Shabbat, right?
Right. According to rabbinic law, a slave has a status. It doesn't work on Shabbat. It's treated. There's one rabbinic dictum that says, Talmudic dictum that says, it's more expensive to have a slave than not to have a slave. It's not worth it for you to do it. The things that you have to do and to give and supply and to be, support, it's just not worth it. I think there was an attempt that way to bypass the scripture that said, well, definitely there are situations bypass it. I think it's not, which is what rabbinic Judaism is about. You mentioned before what slaves would have heard at home, or what they would, in the plantation where they grew up or wherever. There were Jewish slaves as well. In the South, there were Jewish slaves. In the North, it kind of broke down in the same way. There was no great Jewish leaders that I could find, other than a few rabbis that argued, but nobody in the South. There was no rabbis in the South who fought against during slavery, fought against slavery. There were many rabbis in the 20th century that became leaders in the civil rights movement, even in the South as well. But there's another interesting thing that happened is that some slaves, there's a few famous one particular woman, they were in Jewish households and learned all the Judaism, and they started the first church, the first synagogues that were breakaway. One was the daughter of a minister. The first synagogues which were a breakaway from the church, and part of their theology was Christianity is a religion of slavery. Yeah, and Judaism is not. Well, Jews didn't have, nobody was using Judaism to support slaves. I think that's what I get out of the slave owners in the South. They weren't using the Torah to justify. Whereas in Christianity, that there was that theology to justify. There are estimates between 20,000 and 200,000 African American Jews, self-defined Jews, who are not Jews that have converted, say, out of the religion, as Rabbi Sandra Lawson, we won't get to her today, but you got something she wrote about Juneteenth. She converted to Judaism, but there are those that attributed their Jewishness or their Israeliteness to the fact that they're the lost tribes. And some very strong congregations in Chicago and Philadelphia. Michelle Obama's first cousin is a well-known rabbi from that community. And then so there's the Black Hebrews, and then there's some that are parallel to the what was something of new
Sounds like, how
60
many syllables?
Muslims, Nation of Islam.
Oh, yeah.
And so there was a parallel to that also, a smaller parallel that claimed Judaism, nation of whatever it was called, which was very often just kind of the way to band together to fight in radical ways in the second half of the 20th century. So interesting stuff. We have a member of Or Hamidbar, somebody who joins us from Baltimore, who is African American and has the title rabbi. I didn't ask too much, but when I asked about her background, she said, I don't know, we've always been Jewish. Mm-hmm. In my family, we've always been Jewish. So that goes back at least 150 years, right? I guess people's memory. So there's a lot out there that I don't know, which I think is fascinating. But what I do know is that there's no there's no way to justify whatsoever any kind of looking at race from Jewish sources. The sources in the Bible that have been utilized have not been utilized by Jews, because there have been Jews of color since, for over 2,000 years. Jews have lived everywhere in the world. So now, just a moment, we'll end with the AME.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly kind of do it in a very big little nutshell, kind of history of Methodism in America. And you'll see here this short letter, you can read it. This was the last letter of John Wesley's life, and it's a letter that he wrote to William Wilberforce, who you may know if you've seen that fabulous movie, Amazing Grace. William Wilberforce was the abolitionist in England that ended the slave trade in England, and it ended about 20 years before 30 years before it happened in America, maybe even more. But this is what, 1791. So Wilberforce has already worked, for Parliament, is a long, arduous process. And John Wesley hated slavery, and he was commending William Wilberforce in his work with that. So that's kind of how, when Wesley died, it was a very much an anti-slavery faith. And like everything else, when it became a church, and in America, in Philadelphia, a few years after the church had been established, a big Methodist church, they were making the Black Methodists, because there were several, because it was such an anti-slavery place, there were a lot of Black Methodists, they were having to sit in the balcony. And a guy named Richard Allen, who was a seminary educated, good speaker, preacher, very effective preacher, said this is untenable. So he walked out. There was a big walkout on Sunday, and then all the Black people walked out, and they started their own church called the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, which you perhaps have heard. Then there's also the Zion. There's a couple other Black Methodist churches, denominations that emerged during that time, and that kind of became the thing. If you're Methodist and you're Black and you want to be Methodist, you go to the Black Methodist church. It was kind of its own built-in segregation in a way. And it's interesting now, the AME church is very much structured like a Methodist church. There's bishops, there's district superintendents, there's the Book of Discipline. They kind of operate the same way. And then what happened as time went on, the Methodism was extremely popular denomination in the first half of the 19th century for any number of reasons. And so it was growing by leaps and bounds in the North and the South. And in the 1850s, there were a lot of abolitionists in the North, anti-slavery in the North. And some of the Black, and they, at their general conference, they said, no bishop can own slaves. Well, there were a couple of bishops in the South that owned slaves, and they weren't willing to be told what to do. So the church split in two, and then there was the Methodist Church North and the Methodist Church South. And you can look at the history and you see where the dividing line was. And then you'll even in like Montana, there's some Methodist Church South and Methodist Church North. It kind of depending on what you believe, mostly around slavery, determine what congregation you were in, you know. And so that went on for a very long time until really until I think it ended in the 40s or so, but there was still then what was when it just became the Methodist Episcopal Church. That's when they developed what they called the Central Conference, which is where all the black churches. So it was still pretty segregated. There was a central, but they all came to the same general conference and everything, but still black churches had their black churches and white church, whatever. So in 1968, when the United Methodist Church was created, that ended the Central Conference and created a church where, at least on paper, you know, everybody's equal and there's a, you know, a place for leadership and all this. Not for, yeah, and even for women were being ordained already. But you still see, you know, in the Methodist Church, there's still essentially more black Methodist churches and white Methodist churches. It's somewhat integrated, but not, I would say, not extensively. But in the South, maybe it's more so. In the South, maybe it's more so. But anyway, that's kind of, you can read more about it in that link that I sent, or I made copies if you want to look at it, the history of the Methodist Church. It very much kind of follows, it seems to me, American thinking about race relations. You know, move ahead and then it falls back, and then we move ahead and it still falls back. Like it's 2 steps forward, 2.5 steps back. So there's a little progress, but it's slow.
So back to Frederick Douglass and the issue of being honest, yet also having hope. This is difficult material that we covered today. Of course, we didn't do it justice, right? And this is the beginning of other conversations, not just about this particular issue of race relationships in the United States and our own culture, but also of this idea of going to texts that are part of our American history and lifting them up, sanctifying them by studying them and looking at them in a very, very serious way on the background of our faith traditions, of our progressive faith traditions. So I want to thank Pastor Jane for agreeing to do this little
Well, I'm
ministry.
going to thank Rabbi David. It's kind of my pastor. You're kind of my, yeah, you're kind of my pastor. Yeah, it's been a delight once again working with you and for bringing this to us.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you guys.
Well,
Thanks to all our friends at home.
And to Madalena as well.
And Madalena, yeah.
And what perhaps we'll figure out a way to continue this in one way or another. Anyway, good. May it be a good day and a good rest of the
Set us
summer.
on a good path forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks everybody. Thanks, great for coming. It's great having you here today.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
We wonder what you like.
Sasha.